Lucy Bell's story. I often think back to that day in 1804 when we packed our belongings into wagons, leaving North Carolina behind for the wilds of Tennessee. John's voice still echoes in my memory, full of optimism and excitement as he spoke of our new life on 1,000 acres of rich, untouched land. It was a chance to build a legacy for our children, to carve out a piece of the world that we could call our own. For years, we did just that. The land was hard, but it was good to us. Our children grew strong, and the few neighbors we had became like family. The Red River, with its gentle flow and shaded banks, became a place of laughter and peace. The townspeople often gathered there, and we were happy. I think back to those years often, knowing now how fleeting they were. John thrived in Robertson County. He worked from dawn till dusk, clearing land, building our home, raising our crops. He was a good man, generous and kind. We opened our home to those in need, offering shelter and food to anyone who asked. I remember the warmth of those evenings, our children laughing around the fire, our neighbors telling stories long into the night. Those were the good days. I wish they had lasted longer. But everything changed in the summer of 1817. John had gone out to the cornfield early in the morning, just as he always did. He came back later than usual that day, and when he did, he looked pale, shaken in a way I'd never seen before. "What is it, John?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron as I met him at the door. He didn't answer at first, just stared out toward the field with a strange, distant look in his eyes. Finally, he said, I saw a dog." "A dog?" I repeated, confused. "What's so strange about that?" He shook his head, still staring into the distance. "Not like any dog I've seen before. It was twisted, like its bones had been broken and healed wrong. And its eyes, Lucy, they weren't right. They looked like a man's eyes." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "You must have been mistaken. Maybe it was just the light playing tricks on you." "No," John said firmly, his voice low and strained. "I shot at it, but when I went to check, it was gone. There weren't even any tracks." I could see the fear in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. John wasn't a man easily frightened, but whatever he had seen out there had shaken him deeply. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong, though I didn't yet know just how wrong. The knocking started a few nights later. It was soft at first, just a few taps on the walls of the house. At first, we thought it was the wind, or maybe some small animal scratching at the wood. But it continued, night after night, always the same. The sound would start at one end of the house, then move to the other. John and the boys would get up to check, but there was never anyone there. It was unsettling, but we tried to dismiss it. We had too much work to do to let a little knocking trouble us. But it didn't stop. Each night, the knocking grew louder, more persistent. I could see the strain it was putting on John, though he tried to act as though nothing was wrong. He believed it was the work of pranksters, local children perhaps, trying to scare us. I wanted to believe that too, but something about the way the sounds moved, always just out of reach, just beyond our sight, filled me with a growing sense of dread. One evening, after another fruitless search for the source of the noise, John sat down heavily at the table, rubbing his temples. "I don't understand it," he muttered. "No tracks, no signs of anyone outside. It's like they vanish into thin air." "They?" I asked quietly. "You think it's more than one person?" He looked up at me, his face tight with frustration. I don't know what to think anymore, but whatever it is, I'll catch them. They can't keep this up forever. I wanted to believe him, but as the nights dragged on, I began to fear that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. It was in May of 1818, almost a year after John's encounter with the strange dog, that things truly escalated. Our sons were asleep in their room when they were woken by the sound of something gnawing on their bedposts. The boys, brave as they were, got up to investigate, but the moment they moved, the sound stopped. There was no sign of a rat, no damage to the wood, nothing to explain the noise. The next night, it happened again, louder this time. And the night after that, the gnawing was accompanied by a new sound, someone gasping for air, as though they were choking, coming from under the bed. The boys were terrified, and so was I. We searched the room, the house, every corner, but found nothing. John tried to keep the family calm, insisting it was all a trick, but I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. We hadn't told anyone in town about what was happening, not yet. John was determined to keep it quiet, convinced that he could catch whoever was behind the strange occurrences. But after that night, when the boys came to us, pale and shaking, unable to sleep, John knew we couldn't keep it to ourselves any longer. "I've never seen anything like it," John told our neighbour James Johnston when he finally confided in him. James was a good man, a trusted friend, and when John told him about the knocking, the gnawing and the choking sounds, James didn't laugh or dismiss it as nonsense. He listened carefully, his brow furrowed in concern. "I'll spend the night with you," James said finally. "See for myself what's going on. If it's someone playing tricks, we'll catch them together." That night, James stayed with us, and sure enough, the knocking started again. James and John searched the house inside and out, but found no one. Then the gnawing began, followed by the gasping sounds. James looked shaken, though he tried to hide it. "God help us," he muttered under his breath, his face pale as he gathered his things and left in the middle of the night. As time went on, my daughter Betsy, my poor sweet Betsy, bore most of it. At first, it would pull her hair while she slept, yanking her out of her dreams with such force she would wake up screaming. Then came the slaps. They echoed through the house, sharp and cruel, leaving red welts on her delicate skin. I could only watch, helpless, as her terror grew with each passing day. It wasn't just physical either. There was something deeply sinister in the way it seemed to fixate on her, as if it wanted her to break. "Mama," she whispered to me one night, tears streaming down her face. "Why is it hurting me?" I had no answer for her. My heart felt like it was breaking every time she cried out in pain. I tried everything, a mother's prayers, old remedies passed down by the women in my family, even the aid of our neighbours. But no one could help us. No prayer, no charm could stop the assault on my Betsy. "I don't know, my love," I whispered, clutching her tightly, my own tears mixing with hers. "But I swear, we will find a way to end this." One afternoon, Betsy went walking along the edge of our property, near the trees that bordered the riverbank. She had a habit of walking there when she needed to clear her mind. It was a beautiful day. The sun shone, the birds sang, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the nightmare had lifted, as if Betsy could finally escape the weight of the evil that plagued her. But then she saw the girl. Betsy came running back to the house, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing, her body trembling so violently I feared she might faint. "Betsy, child, what is it?" I asked, holding her tightly, my own heart beginning to race. "What did you see?" She could barely speak through her tears, but when she did, her voice was broken, trembling. "There was a girl," she whispered, her words coming out in ragged breaths. "Hanging in the tree. She was dead, Mama, but she was speaking to me. She told me I should not marry Joshua." I felt my blood run cold. "Where did you see her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my own terror rising. "By the river," she gasped. "She was hanging from the branches like a doll, swaying in the wind. Her face, it was pale, her eyes open and staring right at me. And her mouth, oh God, her mouth was moving, speaking to me." "What did she say?" I whispered, afraid to hear the answer. Betsy's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, her eyes distant, as if she were reliving the moment. She said I mustn't marry him, that if I do, something terrible will happen. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I had always feared the spirit's malevolent intentions, but this was something else. It wasn't just tormenting Betsy, it was trying to control her life, to poison her happiness. "Mama, she looked so real," Betsy whimpered, clutching my hand. Her hair was tangled and her clothes were torn. But her voice, it didn't sound human. It was like she was speaking from somewhere far away, somewhere dark. I didn't know what to say. I had no words of comfort, no explanation. All I could do was hold her, my heart breaking for my daughter, as the evil that had latched onto our family seemed to tighten its grip. "Betsy, don't marry Joshua Gardner," the spirit would chant, over and over again. It tormented her until she was too afraid to even consider marrying him. The love she had for Joshua was crushed under the weight of fear, and she ended the relationship. I hated seeing my daughter so heartbroken, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it. After that, word spread quickly through the town. People began to talk about the strange happenings at the Bell House, about the knocking, the gnawing, the sounds of gasping breath in the dark. The townspeople were kind, offering their help. Some even volunteered to spend nights in our home, hoping that their presence might put an end to the disturbances. But it didn't matter who stayed with us. The knocking continued, the noises persisted, and no one could explain it. Some people whispered that perhaps it was one of our own children, playing tricks to gain attention. Others speculated that someone with a grudge against John was behind it all. But no matter how many times we searched, no matter how many people came to witness the events, there was never any evidence, never any clue as to who or what was behind it. By 1819, John's health had begun to deteriorate. At first it was small things, a twitch in his hands, a strange blankness in his eyes when he stared off into the distance. But as the weeks went by, the episodes became more frequent. His face would contort, his jaw twitching uncontrollably, his eyes blinking out of sync. During these episodes, he wouldn't speak. He would just sit, staring into nothing, as though he was lost in some dark place none of us could reach. The neighbors noticed it too, and whispers began to circulate around town. People were starting to fear that whatever was haunting our family wasn't just a prank or a cruel joke. Some began to believe it was something far darker. There was one name that kept coming up in conversation: Kate Batts. Kate Batts was an eccentric woman, known for her strange behavior and her unfortunate circumstances. Her husband was disabled, her children had all died young, and she had a way of speaking that made people uneasy. She used big words that didn't quite fit, as though she was trying too hard to sound intelligent. People began to say that the entity tormenting our family was connected to her, that perhaps she had cursed us. One afternoon, as John sat in his usual spot by the fire, twitching and blinking, James Johnston came by to visit. "Have you heard what people are saying, John?" James asked, sitting down across from him. John didn't look up, but I could see the tension in his body. He knew what James was going to say before the words left his mouth. "They're saying it's Kate Batts," James continued, lowering his voice. "That she's the one behind all of this. A witch, they're calling her." John finally looked up, his face tight with frustration. "Nonsense," he muttered. "Kate's no witch. She's just a woman with a hard life. People are always looking for someone to blame when things go wrong." "I know that," James said, "but you know how people are. They see what they want to see." John didn't respond, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He didn't believe Kate was behind the haunting, but the townspeople's fear was palpable, and it was beginning to take on a life of its own. As John grew increasingly ill, the eerie happenings around our home became more frequent, more intense. It was as if the spirit that had haunted us for so long had gained strength as John's own health waned. One late afternoon, when the sky was painted with the warm hues of sunset, our daughter Esther went to collect eggs from the hen house. She had always been brave, but the weight of the strange occurrences was starting to wear on her too. She had just reached the hen house when she heard soft footsteps behind her. Thinking it was one of our neighbors, she turned around. There, walking slowly toward the house, was a woman dressed all in black. Her head was down, her face hidden by a large bonnet. Esther paused, feeling a strange unease creep into her heart, but she told herself it was nothing to be alarmed about. Surely the woman was a neighbor coming to check on us, perhaps to offer some help as John's illness worsened. But something about the figure felt wrong. Esther continued collecting the eggs, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to dismiss the odd feeling. When she emerged from the hen house, she looked again and saw the woman was now much closer to the house, standing in the middle of the yard, completely still. The air was heavy and silent. Esther called out a greeting. "Good evening, Ma'am." The woman did not respond. She simply stood there, unmoving, her head still bowed as if she hadn't heard a word. Esther's heart began to pound, a cold wave of fear washing over her. She was about to turn back to the house when she noticed the woman slowly raise her hands to her bonnet. She untied the strings with deliberate, trembling fingers and lifted the bonnet off her head, revealing long, matted black hair. But it wasn't just the woman's strange appearance that filled Esther with terror. It was the way she began to frantically run her fingers through her tangled hair, tugging at the strands, her motions becoming more violent with each second. Esther could only watch, frozen, as the woman began tearing out clumps of her hair, the thick black strands falling to the ground and scattering in the breeze. Terrified, Esther dropped her basket of eggs and ran for the house, her legs moving as fast as they could. When she burst through the door, she called for her sister with a voice thick with fear. Elizabeth, her older sister, came rushing from the kitchen. "What is it, Esther? What happened?" she asked, her brow creased with concern. "There's a woman outside. She's pulling out her hair," Esther gasped, breathless, her face pale as she dragged Elizabeth toward the window. Together they looked out across the yard. Sure enough, there was the woman, now standing motionless in the distance, her hair wild and uneven, patches of her scalp exposed where she had torn it away. But what terrified them more was the way she suddenly stopped her frantic motions and turned slowly to face the house. She lifted her head, and for the first time the sisters saw her eyes. Black, hollow and cold, staring directly at them through the window. Esther grabbed Elizabeth's arm, her heart pounding so loudly she could hardly hear her own thoughts. They stood there too frightened to move as the woman slowly walked away, disappearing behind the house. But just as they thought the terror had passed, something even more disturbing appeared. Behind the woman, emerging from the shadows like phantoms, were 3 small children. Esther hadn't noticed them before, but there they were, walking in single file, their faces pale and expressionless. They followed the woman silently, their tiny feet barely making a sound as they trudged across the yard. The sisters watched in horror as the woman and the children climbed the trees on the Bell property. Trees that had stood tall and strong for years, now swaying unnaturally beneath their weight. But it wasn't the swaying that sent a shiver down their spines. It was the way the woman and the children perched on the branches, staring directly at the house, their dark eyes never leaving the window where Esther and Elizabeth stood frozen with fear. Minutes passed like hours as the trees continued to sway, the figures in the branches holding their gaze, unmoving, unblinking. It was only when they heard the distant sound of a horse approaching that the spell seemed to break. Esther's husband, Alexander, returned from his work in the fields. Seeing the trees swaying violently in the distance, he hurried inside, where he found the sisters huddled together by the window, their faces pale with terror. "What's going on?" Alexander asked, his voice filled with concern as he looked out the window. "The woman," Esther whispered, her voice barely audible. "She was out there, pulling her hair out. And the children. Did you see the children?" Alexander squinted, his eyes scanning the property, but he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The trees were swaying, yes, but there was no woman, no children. "There's no one there, Esther," he said, his tone calm, though confusion flickered in his eyes. Esther and Elizabeth exchanged a glance, their hearts still racing. How could he not see them? They had been so clear, so real, just moments ago. "Come on, let's check," Alexander said, grabbing his rifle from the wall and stepping outside. The sisters followed cautiously, their eyes darting from tree to tree, expecting the strange figures to reappear at any moment. But when they reached the yard, the woman and the children were gone. The ground where they had stood was undisturbed, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. Only a few strands of black hair, caught in the branches of the trees, remained as evidence of the strange encounter. As the months dragged on, the spirit's presence grew more malevolent. It seemed to latch onto John as his health continued to worsen. He became prone to fits. His eyes would glaze over, and his face would contort into shapes that I could barely recognize. He would stand for hours, staring blankly into the distance, as if something unseen was whispering to him, something only he could hear. One afternoon, as John and our son Drew were out walking near the edge of the farm, Drew came running back, frantic. "It's got him!" he yelled. "Something's taken hold of him!" I rushed outside and found John on the ground, his body twisted unnaturally, his hands raised as if trying to fend off something invisible. His face was drawn in terror, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "John, what is it?" I cried, trying to pull him back to himself. But he wouldn't speak. He just kept looking past me as if seeing something I could not. By the winter of 1820, John was bedridden, too weak to even sit up on his own. We did our best to care for him, but it was clear that something far beyond our understanding was killing him. One morning in December, I went to wake him, only to find that he was unresponsive, his body cold and still. He was breathing, but barely. I called for the doctor, but there was nothing he could do. That evening, as we sat by John's bedside, trying to comfort him in his final hours, we found a small vial of dark liquid in the cabinet. A vial none of us had ever seen before. The doctor examined it and confirmed our worst fear. It was poison. John passed the next day. After his death, the house grew quiet. The knocking stopped, the gnawing ceased, and the choking sounds disappeared. But the fear never left me. I could still feel it, lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting. People began to say that the land was cursed, that the spirit, whatever it was, had taken its vengeance on John and would now leave us in peace. But I knew better. It wasn't over. It would never be over. They call it the Bell Witch now, the spirit that haunted our family. Some say it was Kate Batts. Others say it was something older, something darker. I don't know what it was, but I do know this. It took everything from us. My husband, my peace, my hope for the future. I still feel it sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the wind whispers through the trees, or when the house creaks in the night. It's there, just out of sight. Thanks for joining our spooky story time. Bloody subscribe and keep the nightmares coming. Good night.